All right, this is me finishing the lecture on expanding colonies. And I'm going to kind of start where I feel like I left off for most of you. So there might be, I think, one of the classes, this might be a repeat. The big thing I want you to get from developing Virginia is going to be the idea of that things begin to improve over time. That you see that, the indentured servants go through a significant seasoning period. As that seasoning period, as more and more people survive, as the area becomes more settled, various diseases become less impactful, and you just continue to have people coming over. And a lot of that has to do with they stop trying to plant every square inch of Jamestown with tobacco, and they figure out they've got to feed themselves and that kind of thing. And England starts to do something that's a little bit different than what, say, Spain and France did, which is they start to send women over there. And a lot of that has to do with, sorry, it's my Gorky that you're hearing in the background, that they're cleaning out the prisons, they're cleaning out the debtors. And I mentioned earlier that you have this process of enclosing public lands, and this is pushing poor people in England into the cities, into lives of crime. And so when these some of these are going to be women, and when that happens, they begin to be sent over to the New World. Okay, so yes, they have more women, and this is actually, I mean, if you look in the scope of, the role of women and the power that women have in society, this is a period when women have a degree of power, in a very, traditional sense. I mean, when you've got one woman to every 20 guys, that woman's going to have some power. She's going to be able to choose her husband. She's going to be able to choose her conditions. Indentured women are probably going to get out of indentured servitude faster through marriage. They can find somebody that's willing to pay off their indenture. And a lot of this is very practical in that this territory needs all hands on deck. And so if you marry somebody, this is somebody that's going to be your helper, that can help you develop this property, develop this land. Plus, once you have a section of land, you want your children to inherit. And I want you to grasp the idea that this is completely different than what you have in England, where you have primogeniture, where you have, a handful of nobility that own all the land. So this is a huge level of middle-class opportunity that many people many people had never experienced before. And so I just want to be sure that you kind of grasp that. And we'll talk periodically about how women are operating within society. And we'll see really throughout the colonial period, while women don't necessarily have rights according to the law, in fact, they have rights. They have the ability to have an influence on what's going on. In a way that by the time you get to the 1800s, they struggle to have that kind of influence. And I think it's important for us, if we stick in the back of our minds the notion that the United States is here for equality and for opportunity, and we have this mission statement that's in the Declaration of Independence of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. If this is in effect the mission statement of the United States, one prevailing question we should constantly be asking of history is, how does the U.S. fulfill or not fulfill that mission statement? And this is kind of one of those examples of a way that they do, and then we see later they don't. And then we have to have legislation that makes sure that the United States allows women the same opportunities. This seal, I know I talked about it in all the classes. I made my Harry Potter reference. Maryland, I know one of the classes, I think we actually got to this one. And I'm going to move pretty quickly through the establishment of the different colonies. I want you to know a little bit about them, not in the sense that I'm going to ask you who was the proprietor of Maryland. Okay, I'm not going to ask you to remember George Calvert's name, but I do want you to remember the notion, first off, of a proprietary colony. That in this process of colonization, we go from a joint stock company in the England model, okay, that starts with Elizabeth, that is very business-minded, to kind of a transition to a royal colony. Then you're going to have proprietary colonies that are basically gifts of property to loyal servants by the Stuart kings, and that eventually we'll see over time those become sorry, my phone rang, distracted me. Those become royal colonies as well. So we've got several different ways that colonies are kind of created, and we'll talk about Georgia and how it's a little bit different too. And so I want you to know what a proprietary colony is. It's a single owner, absolute administration. And then note that Maryland was meant to be a haven for Catholics, but that they very quickly become the minority, and so you have to have this Toleration Act of 1649. And so a lot of times, people will look at the concept of religious freedom and the Bill of Rights that basically says Congress cannot establish a religion, the so-called Establishment Clause, right? And this is kind of the backstory for this. Now, keep in mind that what they're trying to protect is not Christianity per se. What they're, of course, one can argue that everybody in the 1600s were Christians, so it wasn't, except that wasn't true because Islam was significant in the 1600s. But you don't have, except for a handful of African slaves who were Muslim, you don't have a lot of influence of Islam in the United States in the 1600s. But I do think it's interesting that the concept of freedom of religion is to protect the minority against the majority. That the majority of people who believe a certain thing cannot force their views on a handful of minority people. And we often, and most recently that county clerk, who doesn't want to issue marriage licenses. There's lots of conversations, lots of memes out there about freedom of religion. And what you need to grasp is that, the United States, while these percentages are in flux, and certainly the percentage of Christians in the United States is on the decline, Christianity is still a majority religion. And of that, evangelicalism and Catholicism are still very strong. And so those are the majority religions. And so freedom of religion is not about protecting the majority from decline. Rather, it's about protecting the minority. And so I think that that's an important lesson that we can take from Maryland, just in understanding what it is the laws of this country mean and how we should interpret current events, how we should interpret actions in view of what is the true mission statement, what were the true things that the Founding Fathers what was their historical experience. And that's what I'm trying to tell you right here, is the historical experience of the Founding Fathers and why certain legislation that they would have put into place, why they would have felt that that was very important. So just kind of know that. Know that they had manors and farms and all that kind of stuff, just like Virginia did. But the other big thing I want you to note, they don't like Virginia. The colonial experience was one of a bunch of different colonies that hated each other and saw each other as competition. And Maryland and Virginia in particular did not like each other very much. And, they were early colonies. They competed to provide tobacco, to provide tobacco, to provide the Caribbean islands that were completely devoted to sugar, to provide them with the grains and the food sources for the owners and the slaves. And so there was a lot of economic competition between them. Just some pictures about Maryland. And kind of gives you an idea how it looked. Maryland was probably, it depends on where you are. There's sections of Maryland that look a whole lot like Virginia. Then there's other sections that look, the farms are much smaller. So just kind of keep that in mind. In the north, you have the French trading for fur. They spark what is called a beaver war between the Iroquois and the Huron. Any fans of the movie Last of the Mohicans actually kind of flips the roles around a little bit. Just FYI, still a great movie though. It comes on TV periodically, so if you get a chance, watch it. But the essence of these beaver wars is that I want you to come away with realizing, first off, that the Iroquois become the power players in the colonial region. They're the Indian group that the Native Americans turn to and deal with most often. And they operate on a confederacy basis. So there's, we alluded to the fact that the Aztecs and the Spanish had some things in common. The Iroquois, in their sense of having a council, of having, speakers for the tribes, in that sense, the British and the French, well, the British especially, would have recognized that. Now, what the British don't grasp, and the French, I'm not sure the French might have grasped it a little better, is that the Confederacy of the Iroquois was dominated by local politics. And every now and then you'll hear somebody refer to the fact that our current American system has a foundation in the Iroquois system. And that's a pretty loose connection because there's just enough differences that we can't draw a direct line. But certainly, if we're thinking about the historical context in which our founding fathers operated, knowing, and Benjamin Franklin was a huge fan of the Iroquois Confederacy and how they functioned and the emphasis on local control and how they nominated people to go represent them to the Confederacy. Now, the problem is the Confederacy as a unit was far more fractured than anything that the United States develops. Well, maybe under the Articles of Confederation, but that goes away because it's not effective. So you see that the Iroquois win the Beaver War. They're heavily engaged in trade. And one thing that historians can point to is the impact of what we would call nascent or early capitalism and its effect on these Indian tribes. The Iroquois are trying to dominate this trade so they can make money. And this is initially happening with the French. And then later on, when the French go away, it'll be replaced by the English. But they are trying to make sure that they are the only ones that control this, which is a very capitalistic impulse. So just kind of keep that in mind. Disease and warfare, though, these beaver wars have a horrible toll on the Iroquois. And matter of fact, by the time you get to the 1700s, most of the Iroquois try to sit out of as many conflicts as possible because the beaver wars had taken such a huge toll on their population, that in combination with diseases and that kind of thing. And so you can read here kind of the impact of that. You do see the French, they kind of cede the East Coast to the English, and they kind of let them do their thing. And instead they begin to focus on developing the Great Lakes region, developing the Mississippi River, and starting to trade up and down that river. So again, this is kind of gives you a sense of what the French are doing. This map here shows you kind of the different size of New France, which is actually quite large, right, in comparison with the English colonies. But I do want to point out that if you look at, and this is kind of a geography concept, right? So the English colonies are long and narrow, which means you have a great deal of diversity between these colonies, which in some ways is going to create problems, but in other ways is going to make the English colonies very resilient because there's such diversity. New France, on the other hand, tends to be this big blob that kind of has this not quite horizontal look, but it's certainly more horizontal than what we see with the English colonies. And the only level of verticalness they have is going up here into the Arctic area. Well, so how much diversity are they going to have? I mean, I think this is reflected in the interests that we talked about in the conquest documents, that France is there for Christianization and they're there for furs. Well, obviously, this territory is going to support that, right? This makes perfect sense. Why would they need to develop a great deal of diversity? Whereas the English are there to exploit business resources, and they're going to want a great deal of diversity. And we see that the early forays down the Mississippi River are kind of the French attempt to create some diversity, but again, they're relying heavily on trade with the Native Americans. Some pictures of the Iroquois and the French, who, if you gathered from the Lejeune document, the Iroquois, They dealt with each other on trade, but then at times they would get very much opposed to each other. One of the issues, too, is that the Huron actually are much more accepting of the French, and they adapt much more quickly to French Catholicism. And the Iroquois perceive that that makes the Huron very weak. So this is another element of kind of the Beaver Wars that, like I said, if we were in a class that was only about Native American tribes, we would go into a great deal of detail about. But in a survey class, we just don't have time. Meanwhile, in England, you've got the Puritans, and I've kind of talked about them before. The Puritans wanted to purify the Church of England. They felt that the Stuart monarchy was bringing too much influence of Catholicism, and they wanted to push that out, and they felt like the government was being dominated by these nobles, and they didn't like that. And so they want to purify the system. And whereas the Separatists are kind of a sect of the Puritans. Now, so before I go any further, keep in mind you've got the Church of England, which is Protestant. Church of England has some Calvinists in it. Those tend to become the Puritans. And then within the Puritans, you're going to have a group called the Separatists that are like, no, we can't fix this country's beyond hope. So what we need to do is, basically go away. And the Separatists have a slightly different type of government. They focus on congregationalism, which is kind of that everybody in the congregation has the same say in what's going on, whereas people in the Puritans that aren't the Separatists, they tend to have more of a church hierarchy. And we'll see that when we talk about Plymouth Rock versus the Massachusetts Bay Colony and that kind of thing. So both groups have Calvinism as an influence, and they feel like Catholicism is too strong in England. They both criticize the monarchy heavily, which does not win them friends with Stuart monarchs. And the Stuart monarchs and Parliament, the Church of England, nobility, those kind of people, they have some laws that are discriminatory towards the Puritans and the Separatists, mostly in the sense that they have to pay a tax, right? Understand that everybody in England was Church of England, and you were supposed to be. And if you chose not to be, they weren't going to burn you at the stake, but you had to pay a tax because the Church of England you had to tithe to the Church of England. So this is part of why the Puritans would have said that the Church of England is way too similar to the Catholic Church, this requirement for tithing. And so they would have taxed people who wanted to go to a Catholic church, or they would have taxed people who wanted to be Puritans or Separatists. And they felt like that wasn't fair. You also have, people don't want to work with the Puritans and the Separatists because they're very dogmatic and, Parliament's so bad and the king's so bad. And so they found that sometimes they got discriminated against. And so I'm not suggesting that they were treated equally, but I am going to say that they were not persecuted in the sense that the word persecuted implies. Persecution implies that you are truly at a disadvantage. And I suppose one could make the argument that paying extra taxes puts you at a disadvantage. So in that sense, maybe. But to me, in comparison with, being burned at the stake, for instance, or, not being allowed to hold a job or something like that, I'm not sure that qualifies for persecution. So, you can have your own feelings about how to define that word. But just kind of keep in mind that their lives weren't that terrible. And I think it's important to note that while you do have an influx of Puritans and Separatists into Massachusetts, it's not like all the Puritans leave England. And I think that alone tells us that it wasn't all that awful in England, right? So kind of this storyline, this myth that we have that the Puritans had to leave England because they were being treated so horribly and they had to come to the United States for religious freedom is actually a bit of an exaggeration. Yes, they wanted a religious freedom, but they wanted that religious freedom. Sorry, checking out a phone. Anyways, so they wanted religious freedom to, first off, not pay extra taxes. And then second off, they really wanted the freedom to say, we can set up a government better than what's existing in England. So just, I mean, that's probably bursting your bubble on the whole Thanksgiving story. But I do just kind of want to lay that foundation there, because the Puritans and the Separatists are important. They established New England. And, you know, we're eventually going to look at the different regional concepts of North America, and that's going to go back into how is New England different from the other territories. So just kind of keep that in mind. Remember also their emphasis on predestination. So some of what's going to push them into North America is going to be the idea that they can set up their own country and let it be completely independent. All right, so in that vein of destroying your Thanksgiving ideas. Sorry. So the Separatists are not necessarily, they're not dirt poor. If they were dirt poor, they would never have been able to leave England, right? But they're not wealthy enough to really be able to carve a niche politically. Some of the Puritans in England were wealthy enough to carve a niche and have some influence in politics. And so we'll talk about them in a minute. The Pilgrims, on the other hand, first off, they feel like England is, you know, there's nothing they can do to save it. It's beyond hope. It's going to go on this perpetual decline. It's predestined to be evil and sinful. And so they want to remove themselves from it. So their first place that they go is to Holland. The Dutch are known as Protestants. They are, you know, much more accepting and open-minded than is now. And so the Separatists go there. They create their little community. But they start to be concerned that the Dutch customs are influencing their children, that the lack of persecution in Holland is, you know, making their kids soft, so to speak. And so they decide that they're going to leave and go to Virginia. And they actually receive a land grant in 1620 from the Virginia Company. So this is about 4 years before King James takes over the Virginia Company. And basically they make a charting error and they land in what is New England. And so they are in some, you know, understand that they only had permission to be in the area of Virginia that the Virginia Company had granted them. So they are in New England without legal permission, essentially. So any kind of jokes or comments around Thanksgiving, and sometimes you see this, I don't know, maybe it's just the circles I run in. There'll be the occasional joke about the Pilgrims being illegal immigrants. And that's a bit of an exaggeration, but there is a level of truth to it. They did not have permission to be on Plymouth Rock, and their decision to stay there was definitely, you know, I mean, ideally they would have traveled to the spot in Virginia where they were supposed to be. The reason they don't continue traveling is they're horribly ill. Diseases run through the ship, and of course the conditions sailing from England to North America. I mean, that's not an easy trip anyway. So they debark on Plymouth Rock, and this is kind of a classic picture that shows you, you know, them getting off the ship. And they are very sick and they're very struggling. Obviously, these are family groups that have come over because they're, you know, these middle-class groups and because they're separatists. So note how different that is than what we saw happening in Virginia, where initially what you had were a bunch of, you know, single men. And then gradually you get this trickle of women coming in. So they failed to bring enough food, right? And the handful of English backers that they had that helped pay for their trip, because remember, these are middle-income people. These are not filthy, stinking rich people. You know, those backers have not sent any supplies yet. And by the spring of 1621, half of the immigrants had died. So the Wampanoag Indians that are kind of living in that area have been impacted by the spread of disease. Now, the Wampanoags have probably had some minimal contact with English and, you know, random Europeans that had sailed along the coast trying to figure out how the coast looked and that kind of thing. So they'd gotten disease that way. It had probably been spread from, you know, contact with and trade with the Iroquois, that kind of thing. And so from their perspective, they're thinking, we need to maintain a power structure and influence in our region. Remember, a lot of these East Coast Indians are very political in that sense with their own native groups. And so they're looking to the English goods, particularly English weapons and, kettles and, cooking utensils, that kind of thing that make life easier. They're looking to those to maintain their power. Remember that native tribes maintain power by having good stuff to give away. And so that's what they're trying to do, right? This is kind of their form of currency. And so what you see is that the Wampanoags start trading with the Pilgrims, because again, this is very much part of the Native American culture. We're going to trade stuff we know you need, and you're going to give us good stuff, and then we're going to have good stuff that's going to make that we're going to be able to trade with other groups, and this is going to help us be more powerful, right? And you've got the whole story of Squanto and the harvest of 1621. Squanto is an interesting, or Tisquantum is his official Indian name, is an interesting story in the sense that he'd probably been he had been captured like 2 different times, and taken, and had then been brought back to the New World. So this poor guy had made the trip between the New World and Europe. One of the reasons that he really becomes kind of the contact person for the Pilgrims is that he knows the language. He can communicate with them. He's more accustomed to European ways, and so he's much more, and he probably kind of struggled within his own Indian group ethnicity, because they would have viewed him as having been kind of tainted by his European contact. We do know that his family group and immediate tribe had been wiped out by disease, so he was kind of, at loose ends. So he really kind of develops this niche by helping the Pilgrims. In past years, I've had people read a selection on Squanto, but I'm not going to have you guys do that this year. But it is interesting, and if you're thinking about History Day topics, Squanto and the exchange of information, that could be an interesting kind of development. So he's there to kind of help them. They very quickly develop, and they actually develop this on the ship. Before they get fully off the ship, this concept of or they develop the Mayflower Compact. And this speaks to the fact that separatists were Congregationalists, where everybody had a say, and they basically decide that everyone's going to have a say. They're going to create a structure of government with a governor and a council and an annual election, and everyone gets to vote. And keep in mind that it wasn't just separatists on the Mayflower. It was people that were not Calvinists, right? And those people have an equal say in the government of Plymouth Rock. And so a lot of this has to do with them trying to make this successful, okay? So there we go. That's kind of the background of Thanksgiving. The Pilgrims rely very heavily on European support and food to help them. The Squanto helps them learn how to farm. And so that within a couple of years, they're doing much better. But that first winter was pretty tough. And so this is where we get our notion of Thanksgiving. But a lot of times the elementary school plays don't even begin to tell the full story. And so I kind of talk about that England is a little bit distracted in the 1620s with James and Charles I and that kind of stuff. So they don't ever worry about the fact that they're actually in the wrong place. They're just allowed, okay, fine, whatever. You do what you do you. And then over time, within a couple of years, they manage to prosper, right? I mean, they've got these family units that create stability. And you see that Squanto's doing a really good job of helping them learn to farm. And initially, because of this relationship with the Wampanoags, they don't have a lot of Native American conflict. Now that will change. Okay, so that won't stay the same. But initially, this is part of why they start being very successful. So I have this painting here. It's kind of a classic, what is wrong with this picture? And you can see that the notion that the Pilgrims were the ones doing the sharing is all wrong. It was nothing like this. And it was the Native Americans who were really being extremely generous to the Pilgrims. because they were on the verge of starvation, and they were horribly racked with disease as well. And so, that's kind of a component. If you look at this from the Native American angle, we see them constantly reaching out to the English, trying to create a balance of a relationship. And when you looked at that William Wood document, many of you kind of initially thought that he was talking about equality. But if you read between the lines of that document, you can see that what he's looking at is what are their weaknesses, right? And so what's going to happen is that the English will very quickly, while the Native Americans approach them as let's try to have a relationship on an equal footing. You need us, we need you. Let's kind of work this out. Very much kind of that Native American diplomacy political concept. For the English, it's about how can we find out what their weaknesses are? How can we exploit their weaknesses? And then don't forget, for the English, land is the big deal. In England, there's not a lot of land, and a lot of it is controlled by nobility. And so for ordinary citizens, the chance to own land is a huge deal for them. And they're looking at all this land in North America, and they get greedy. Right? So if we talked about the Spanish wanting gold and silver, and then how they have to transition to other things because there's a lack of gold and silver. You see the French being greedy for furs, but very quickly the English get greedy for land, and that becomes the thing that they want most of all. Obviously in Virginia, that's going to be to grow tobacco, but in New England, it's about having small family farms. So that takes care of the Pilgrims that are on Plymouth Rock. So now we have the Massachusetts Bay Company. Remember, King Charles I becomes the king in 1625. And I explained to you earlier that, he was even more Catholic than his dad, and he didn't get along with Parliament. And he thought, well, it's good to be the king, right? Everyone should do what I say. And so this conflict with the Puritans that will eventually result in the English Civil War, and the leadership of Cromwell and all that kind of stuff, leads another group of Puritans to create the Massachusetts Bay Company. So this is a joint stock company that is meant to create a colony in the New World. And this is a much better backed financially group than, say, the Virginia Stock Company or the Pilgrims or anything like that. And so they propose this idea of Puritan immigration. So kind of like, the essence of, Maryland being created as a haven for Catholics. They want to create a haven for Puritans. And one of the big things they're wanting to do is basically set up a system of government that can prove to the Stuart monarchy, prove to the Church of England people in Parliament that the Puritan system is the correct way to govern, and that if they would just let the Puritans run everything in England, everything would be perfect. And so this is where the notion of a city upon a hill comes from, and that's actually from a speech and a sermon that John Winthrop gives very early in the establishment of Massachusetts, that's what their purpose is to be the city upon a hill. So that's what they're going to do. They have merchants, landed gentry, lawyers, which is very important, right? Because you'll see in North America the influence of lawyers in our system. And so they're going to get this royal charter mainly because, King Charles is like, yeah, please leave. I'd be perfectly happy if you leave and stop bothering me. And so they get this charter that is for Massachusetts and New Hampshire. So the Puritans are going to go where they're supposed to go. They will successfully land there. Notice that it includes all of this territory up here. Now later on, once the United States has been created, the state of Maine will come out of that. But initially in the colonial period, this area of Maine was part of Massachusetts. So it was quite a large state at one point. And so you can kind of get a sense. The Massachusetts Bay Colony goes through a couple of transitions. You can see from the map here. They start off as a colony, and then they become a province and that kind of thing. So just kind of have that geographical picture in your head. And so basically they go from this charter of stockholders and turn it into a government with an official governor. And this governor has assistants. And adult male church members can vote for who's going to be on the council with the governor. And so in this sense, you have kind of an early concept of kind of representative government. Just know that the requirement was church membership. Now, this will be a bigger deal when we get to the later part of the 1600s, as church membership in the Congregationalist faith is on the decline because, well, I've mentioned before, the Puritans, they don't like Christmas. I mean, the only way you can have fun is to sing hymns. And so they're not super popular with a lot of the people around there. And as more people come into North America, they're like, yeah, I want to go enjoy a beer, and I want to be able to sing and dance, and I want to be able to attend the theater. And so they just don't go along with that particular denomination. So this will be a problem later on. But initially, there's requirements for church membership. They have town representatives. They'll have a bicameral colonial government. So it's one of the first bicameral, which means two houses, a lower house and an upper house. In the United States now, you have the lower house is the House of Representatives that has widespread representation, and the upper house is the Senate. And so basically, you kind of have this early system. So we've got the House of Burgesses in Virginia. You've got, the Massachusetts bicameral system going on up north. So you have a lot of representation developing in these early colonies. And I think it's important because I mentioned the other day that in England, people didn't have that level of representation. And you need to grasp that. And you need to understand that this is one way that from the get-go, the colonies are very, very different from Mother England. Life in New England centers on the church and the town and the family. I remember me saying how in Virginia the headright system means that people are much more spread out. It's much harder to get to town to go to church, and so you have a lot fewer connections going on. But in New England, what we see is that the emphasis on the family and the family unit and Calvinism and Puritanism, this very much leads to a much more solidified community. And so they have a lot more diverse farming because they don't get into the cash crop stuff. And a lot of that has to do with temperature, but also the nature of kind of this Puritan faith that's focused on the family. They also have very high levels of education and literacy because they're Calvinists. And you see that they focus a lot on land ownership versus the concept of servitude that's developing in the Chesapeake. Now, the land ownership will have the same effect that the headright system has in Virginia, which is that it puts pressure on native populations because we keep expanding land territory, right? The Puritans are always needing more land. And so that will create some issues later on. This is just kind of a picture to give you a sense of what they look like. And I actually think this is a picture of a Quaker family because, and we'll talk, and I think that if you watch the Puritans, the Mr. Betts Faith video that we watched in class the other day, it mentioned about the Quakers and Anne Hutchison and all that kind of stuff. So that the Puritans don't like the Quakers, and I'll go into that in some more detail here in a second. Keep in mind that Massachusetts is not, while they have a representative system of government, it's not all that democratic. And it is absolutely theocratic, right? A theocracy is a government that's controlled by the church. Think, Saudi Arabia has kind of a theocratic monarchy, right? I mean, they kind of have a blended system. And so anytime the church is a key component of how government functions, you're going to have a theocracy. ISIS and the Islamic State that they're trying to create is largely a theocracy, right? And so the church controls everything: taxes, justice, morality, and all that kind of stuff. And so there's a very tight control on society. Sorry, that's my Yorkie. So they're very, very much controlling what everybody does. Church membership is an absolute requirement. Even though you do tend to have far more people voting, remember this is a theocratic system. So it gets kind of, when you try to think of this historical context the Founding Fathers would have seen, what they had seen was what theocracy and what the emphasis on religion can do to a democratic system. They oppose dissent. In other words, you can't disagree with the governor and the main party line with the Puritans. So anybody who begins to think differently in a religious sense, we're not even talking a political sense, we're talking a religious sense, they're going to be treated very, very badly. And of course, I want you to remember that Calvinism emphasizes that you read Scripture, you have your own relationship with God. Well, this is one of kind of the disconnects between, say, the faith part of Puritanism and how their puritanical government is developed in Massachusetts, which is that their faith encourages people to explore God and explore religion on their own, whereas their government that's, controlled by their church doesn't allow people to disagree at all. And so this is a recipe for problems, okay? This is directly opposite the Chesapeake, which has very little church influence, because people are so spread out. So the church is never a strong factor in the Chesapeake. And remember, the Chesapeake area was founded first. So the notion that, we're founded upon God and freedom of religion, that's not entirely true, because the first colony was Virginia, which was all about making money. Voting was limited to wealthy landowners, with center of powers being way out of touch to the frontier. That is incredibly important for you to remember for next week's Bacon and Berkeley documents, that the people on the frontier were felt left out of the system. And so you've kind of got this question of, is this truly the model of American democracy? And we can see that if you look in 2015 democracy, it's not. It has, one might argue that wealthy people have too much influence in politics. But certainly this idea that you have to be a member of a church or something like that. And so you had much less widespread representation, except that you have more representation in the colonies than you had in England, and that's very important to remember. So let's go back to this notion of dissenters, just mostly because this is the fun part of the story with the Puritans, which I say fun, put quotations around that, because when I say fun, it's just interesting. It's not fun for the dissenters, obviously, but it's an interesting story in the development of the colonies. Certainly it's interesting in understanding Massachusetts. It also helps us understand some of the expansion in New England, okay? So Massachusetts and Plymouth, they begin to grow and thrive and develop. Plymouth eventually gets absorbed by Massachusetts. And because Puritanism emphasizes this personal relationship and this personal study of God's Word, people begin to have different viewpoints about how God relates to us and how He reaches out to us and that kind of thing. And so you have this huge question of God's revelation to the individual versus the power of the church in the form of a theocratic government, and which one is stronger. So you can see right off the bat that there's a conflict within this theocratic system. To run a government, you have to have people on the same page. But if the foundation of your faith is, I interact with God on my own terms, how are you going to choose those sides, right? So what you're going to see is that you have different groups splitting off from the main Protestant kind of Massachusetts group. They will each take followers with them, and they will cause the expansion and the creation of colonies in New England. For example, Thomas Hooker, 1634, believed that church membership was too restricted, that the voting standards, that the blending of religion and politics and the requirement of church membership was not giving people enough say in how the colony was run. And so Massachusetts lets him create Connecticut. And they say, here, go to Connecticut, do what you want, stop being a problem for us. Later on, he has New Haven, right? Which will create another little section that wants stricter standards for church membership. So they want fewer people to vote. Now, New Haven will eventually be absorbed into Connecticut, but just get the sense that we've got lots of splinter groups developing, and these splinter groups move away from Massachusetts and create new settlements. Roger Williams is the big one, okay? 1636, he establishes Rhode Island. He's the first person that argues for separation of church and state. And he goes back to this problem of how can you have an individual faith and yet still have a stable government if you have, that says one thing. And so his answer is, well, we need to separate church and state. Let people have their religious views, and then let's have a form of government that has nothing to do with church membership. So he denounces the Massachusetts Bay Colony, the way they're doing things, their theocratic system. He's also starting to get very frustrated with their treatment of Indians, because by the 1630s, all this influx of Puritans has meant that there's constant demand for land acquisition, and that's creating problems with Native Americans, just like we saw in Virginia with the Powhatans. And so we kind of have this huge kind of break that's happening. One of the more interesting stories is Anne Hutchinson. And in 1638, she was a woman that studied the Bible. She was very spiritual. She had basically created her own Bible study. And her Bible study started off as only witnessing to women, right? So she would witness to women, and then eventually some of these men started showing up. So she starts having this, co-ed Bible study that starts really questioning the power of the church, the Puritan church, and especially the theocracy. And she starts really talking about having this special relationship with God and not having, that going to church on a required basis. Because understand, church attendance was a requirement in Massachusetts. You had to be at church or they fined you. And if you didn't go to church often enough, they could kick you out. And if you got kicked out, you would lose your power to vote, right? So this is kind of what she's starting to address, that how can the church dictate to people the terms of their faith? And she ends up getting called before a court for heresy and for blasphemy and all this kind of stuff. And the Puritan church goes back to the notion that women are not supposed to teach. And so they criticize her for that, and they, really kind of persecute her. In different times, I've had people read some of her trial transcripts. It's really pretty sad. It's very, very clearly an attack on her, them trying to silence her. She agrees to be silent and to stop teaching her Bible study. And then I can't remember off the top of my head now. I think she starts teaching to women again, and they finally say, no, you got to leave. And so she basically takes a group of people with her, and she settles on Long Island. Now, she will eventually be killed by Native Americans in an attack that was probably spurred by the pressure that the Massachusetts Bay Colony was putting on Native Americans. But Anne Hutchinson is definitely an example of kind of early female leadership in the colonies. And this is true in New England, just like we see women in the Chesapeake region having power. Now, obviously, Anne Hutchinson is not able to stand up against the church authority. The church authority is far too organized and far too strong. But she is kind of an instructive person there. And she is very, very critical of the church. And so I just think, girls, it's good to hear stories about these early women and the things that they tried to accomplish. So very soon, we see in the 1630s, one of the conflicts that will lead to Anne Hutchinson being attacked is going to be the Pequot War. The Pequots were stronger than the Wampanoags, and so they were kind of the big power up in that New England area. And because the Puritans focused on personal spirituality and predestination, they didn't feel any obligation to save the Indians, right? So the Pilgrims got along fine with them initially, with the Wampanoags. But very quickly, as more Puritans come in, as the theocratic system of government takes over, as the desire and the demand for more farms comes out, the role of having a good relationship with the native tribes just becomes less and less important. And so they start to have a major conflict with the Pequots over expansion. And these Puritan men who are supposed to be so godly take this idea of predestination, and they use this as a justification to attack the Pequots. Now, there had been some quid pro quo going on here. The Pequots had attacked some people, and so, And so it's not like they just randomly said, yeah, let's go pick a fight with them. It's the same kind of story that we see with the Powhatan Indians in the Chesapeake, that the pressure on land expansion causes some minor conflicts, and those minor conflicts have a tendency to erupt in larger conflicts, and the Pequot War is the big example of that. And so the Pequot War, you get all these Puritan guys. They basically surround a Pequot village, set it on fire, and wait for all the people to run out so they can kill people, as they run out of a burning town. Again, not what we would consider to be godly behavior. But remember, they don't have any imperative to Christianize these people, and they see them as violent and savage, and they see, in the concept of predestination, these people are on the losing side, so what do they really have to worry about? I just want you to have the notion that these Puritan colonies, while they're definitely a huge part of the establishment of the United States, they are not perfect. And there's disconnect and there's lack of consistency between the religious views that were espoused to bring them here and how they act when they get here. And I think that's just kind of important to know. I think it helps us understand modern situations better. I think it, helps us look at those situations in a different way. And I just have a couple pictures about the Pequots, but kind of show you. This particular engraving was actually done from that time period, so it's a primary source, whereas the one before that is just a random picture of colonial militia in New England. So I think that, you need to take away that in some ways the New England story is very different from the Chesapeake story, and in some ways it's very similar. So we need to grasp that. In previous years, I've had people read about the Pequot conflict and how the Pequot Indians were almost, put to extinction, I think, in the 1970s. The Pequots were down to like 20 or 30 people. And through a process of kind of marriage and natural reproduction, and thanks to the development of a casino, the Pequots, have now significantly increased their numbers, and they have actually a pretty successful casino up in the New England area somewhere. And so I think that's kind of interesting. So just keep the story in mind. That is it, I believe, for the Expanding Colonies 1. And it's less than an hour. Yay. So if you will, I will be doing Expanding Colonies 2 to get us prepared to talk about Bacon and Berkeley. And then I should have some kind of discussion board to show that you have listened to the lectures. Thank you very much.